When the Second World War officially ended in August 1945, the world moved on with astonishing speed. Nations rebuilt, borders shifted, and former enemies became uneasy allies in a new global order defined by the Cold War. Yet for some men, the war never truly ended. In remote jungles across the Pacific, a handful of Japanese soldiers remained hidden, convinced that surrender was either impossible or dishonorable. Among them was Shoichi Yokoi, a quiet, disciplined infantryman who would remain concealed in the jungles of Guam for nearly 3 decades, long after the last shots of the war were fired. Shoichi Yokoi was born on March 31, 1915, in Aichi Prefecture, Japan. Before the war, his life was unremarkable. He apprenticed as a tailor, learning the skills of sewing, measuring, and working with fabric, abilities that would later prove vital to his survival in ways no one could have imagined. Like millions of Japanese men of his generation, Yokoi was drafted into the Imperial Japanese Army during the final years of the war, when manpower shortages forced the military to call up older reservists and civilians. In 1943, he was deployed to Guam, a small island in the Western Pacific that had been captured by Japan from the United States shortly after Pearl Harbor. Guam held strategic importance as part of Japan's defensive perimeter in the Pacific. The island was fortified with airfields, artillery positions, and infantry units tasked with delaying any American attempt to reclaim it. But by 1944, Japan's position across the Pacific had begun to crumble. American forces, supported by overwhelming naval and air power, pushed steadily westward, island by island. When the United States launched its assault to retake Guam in July 1944, the Japanese garrison was badly outmatched. After weeks of brutal fighting, American forces secured the island in August. Thousands of Japanese soldiers were killed. Others fled into the jungle, choosing concealment over capture. For the Japanese military, surrender was not merely a tactical failure, it was a moral disgrace. Soldiers were taught that capture brought shame not only upon themselves, but upon their families and the emperor himself. Many believed death was preferable to surrender, and this belief shaped the decisions made by men like Yokoi in the chaos following Guam's fall. When organized resistance collapsed, Yokoi and a small group of fellow soldiers disappeared into the dense interior of the island, determined to survive and avoid capture at all costs. In the months that followed, American forces and local Chamorro civilians conducted systematic sweeps of Guam, hunting down remaining Japanese holdouts. Some soldiers were captured, others killed in skirmishes, and some died from starvation or disease. Yokoi and his companions moved constantly, staying hidden during the day and traveling only at night. They learned to fish using handmade nets, gathered roots and fruits, and avoided villages and roads. Every sound carried danger. Every clearing risked exposure. Survival depended on discipline, patience, and silence. Over time, Yokoi's group dwindled. Disagreements over food storage and movement fractured the unit, and eventually, Yokoi found himself alone. Isolation became his permanent condition. He no longer knew who was alive, who had been captured, or whether Japan still fought on. Leaflets dropped by American aircraft announcing the end of the war were dismissed as enemy deception. Rumors overheard from a distance were ignored. For Yokoi, trusting enemy information was unthinkable. The safest assumption, he believed, was that the war continued, and that discovery meant death. By the early 1950s, Yokoi likely knew, at least intellectually, that Japan had been defeated. He heard voices, saw lights, and observed changes in the island that suggested peace had returned. But psychological barriers proved stronger than logic. To emerge after so many years would mean admitting survival when others had died. It would mean facing a society that might see him not as loyal, but as weak. In his own words, later spoken after his discovery, he believed that it was a great shame to return alive. Yokoi adapted to his isolation with remarkable ingenuity. Drawing on his training as a tailor, he fashioned clothing from tree bark fibers, carefully stitching them together to create garments durable enough for years of use. He constructed an underground shelter near the Talifofo River, digging a narrow L-shaped tunnel reinforced with bamboo supports. The design concealed light and smoke while protecting him from storms and detection. Inside, he kept handmade tools, woven baskets, water containers, and traps. He learned to control fire carefully, venting smoke through a narrow exhaust shaft to avoid suffocation and discovery. Days were spent hidden underground. Nights were for movement, fishing, and gathering food. Time was tracked by the phases of the moon. Seasons were remembered by rainfall and river levels. Human contact was avoided completely. Yokoi lived not as a castaway, but as a soldier still on duty, maintaining discipline, conserving resources, and remaining invisible. For nearly 28 years, the world forgot Shoichi Yokoi. Japan rebuilt itself into an economic power. Guam became an American territory bustling with modern life. Children were born, wars were fought elsewhere, and history moved forward. Yet in the jungle, Yokoi lived as if it were still 1944, sustained by routine, fear, and an unyielding sense of obligation. That fragile balance would finally collapse in early 1972, when chance, not war, brought his long vigil to an end. After the American recapture of Guam in the summer of 1944, the world Shoichi Yokoi had known collapsed almost overnight. Japanese defenses were annihilated by overwhelming firepower, and entire units ceased to exist within days. For soldiers like Yokoi, survival no longer meant victory or even resistance. It meant avoiding capture at all costs. Japanese military doctrine had drilled into its men the belief that surrender was worse than death, a betrayal not only of the emperor, but of family and ancestors. Captured soldiers were presumed dead in spirit, their names disgraced. With no clear chain of command remaining and no organized resistance possible, Yokoi and a small group of fellow soldiers fled into Guam's dense jungle interior, convinced that capture by American forces would lead to torture, execution, or permanent shame. In the weeks following the battle, American patrols combed the island aggressively, searching for remaining Japanese holdouts. Loudspeakers broadcast surrender appeals in Japanese. Leaflets were dropped promising humane treatment, and indigenous Chamorro civilians were questioned repeatedly. To Yokoi and others hiding in the jungle, these messages were dismissed as enemy deception. Japanese wartime training emphasized that such tactics were psychological tricks designed to lure soldiers into exposing themselves. Yokoi chose silence and invisibility instead. The group moved constantly, never staying in one place long enough to be detected, avoiding trails and rivers during daylight hours. Hunger quickly became their greatest enemy. With no supply lines and no access to stored rations, the men learned to survive on roots, fruits, small animals, and whatever they could catch with improvised tools. Over time, the group that initially fled together began to fracture. Fear, exhaustion, and disagreement took their toll. Some soldiers attempted to surrender and were either captured or killed during patrol encounters. Others died from disease, starvation, or accidents in the jungle. Yokoi eventually found himself with only 2 remaining companions. Together, they developed survival routines that bordered on ritual. They traveled at night, spoke only in whispers, and avoided open ground at all times. They fashioned fishing traps from bamboo, wove footwear from plant fibers, and learned to identify edible plants through trial and error. The jungle became both a prison and a refuge, offering concealment but demanding constant vigilance. As the years passed, the three men realized that permanent concealment required more than movement. They needed shelter that would not be visible from the air or betray smoke, light, or noise. Yokoi, drawing on his background as a tailor and his practical instincts, proposed constructing underground shelters. They dug narrow, L-shaped caves reinforced with bamboo and roots, carefully camouflaging the entrances with vegetation. These shelters allowed them to remain hidden during the day and protected them from rain, insects, and patrols. Fires were built sparingly and only at night, with ventilation shafts designed to disperse smoke before it reached the canopy. Every decision was made with concealment in mind. Despite their careful routines, tension within the group increased. Disagreements arose over food storage, movement patterns, and the risk of detection. Eventually, the two other soldiers left Yokoi behind, choosing separate hiding areas deeper in the jungle. The separation was not dramatic, but it was final. Yokoi would later describe it as a quiet moment, heavy with unspoken fear and resignation. From that point on, he was entirely alone. The jungle, once shared with comrades, became an endless expanse of silence. He no longer spoke aloud, even to himself. Human language, unused, began to fade from daily life. Years turned into decades. Yokoi continued to refine his survival methods, living almost entirely underground during daylight hours. He fished in nearby rivers at night, eating shrimp, fish, frogs, and small eels. When possible, he collected bananas, papayas, and wild roots. He repaired his clothing constantly, weaving fibers from tree bark into crude but functional garments. His cave grew colder with age, and during rainy seasons, it flooded repeatedly, forcing him to rebuild sections by hand. Illness and injury were constant threats, treated only with rest and determination. There were no medicines, no bandages, and no certainty that he would survive another year. At some point in the early 1950s, Yokoi became aware that the war might be over. He found scraps of newspapers used by local villagers and glimpsed signs of post-war life, new clothing, modern equipment, and unfamiliar structures. Yet even then, he refused to emerge. Knowledge of the war's end did not bring relief. Instead, it intensified his shame. Returning home alive, after failing to die for the emperor, felt unthinkable. In his mind, survival itself had become a form of dishonor. He believed that revealing himself would bring disgrace not only to himself, but to his family. Remaining hidden became not just a survival strategy, but a moral obligation. As time passed, Yokoi lost all contact with the outside world. He later learned that his last remaining companions had died years earlier, likely during a flood. From then on, he assumed he was the last. The jungle became timeless. Without calendars or clocks, he tracked the passage of years by the phases of the moon and seasonal changes. His world shrank to the size of his cave, the riverbank, and a few carefully memorized paths. He lived quietly, invisibly, and with the constant belief that discovery would mean death. By the late 1960s and early 1970s, Guam had transformed completely. It was no longer a battlefield, but a modern American territory with paved roads, vehicles, and expanding civilian settlements. Yet Yokoi remained hidden just beyond the edge of that world, unaware of how much time had passed or how drastically history had changed. His survival, once driven by wartime necessity, had evolved into a form of self-imposed exile that no longer depended on the enemy's presence. The war had ended, but for Shoichi Yokoi, it had never truly stopped. As the years passed, Shoichi Yokoi's world narrowed further, shrinking to a few square yards of jungle floor, the dim interior of his underground shelter, and the slow rhythm of survival that replaced time itself. By the early 1950s, Guam had transformed above him without his knowledge. American military installations expanded, roads were paved, villages rebuilt, and the sounds of post-war life gradually replaced those of battle. Yet beneath the forest floor, Yokoi remained suspended in a psychological time capsule, shaped by imperial Japanese military doctrine, personal shame, and fear of dishonor. Though leaflets announcing Japan's surrender had circulated across the island, Yokoi either never encountered them directly or refused to accept their truth. Even when he later admitted he suspected the war had ended, the belief that surrender was worse than death kept him hidden. Yokoi's isolation was not merely physical, but deeply emotional. His training as a Japanese soldier had emphasized absolute loyalty, endurance, and the belief that capture would disgrace both the individual and his family. This belief became a psychological prison stronger than any physical barrier. He lived under the assumption that American forces or local Chamorro residents would execute him if discovered. To be seen was to die. To surrender was unthinkable. Every rustle in the jungle, every distant human sound reinforced his instinct to hide. As the decades progressed, his life became defined not by hope of rescue or return, but by avoidance and concealment. His underground shelter evolved into a carefully engineered space. Dug into a riverbank near the Talafofo River, it followed an L-shaped design that concealed light and smoke from the outside. Bamboo reinforced the walls and ceiling, while woven plant fibers lined the interior to provide insulation. He slept on a narrow bed of leaves and bark, keeping his possessions arranged with disciplined order. Fire, which could betray his position, was used sparingly and only at night, vented through a narrow shaft designed to disperse smoke invisibly into the forest canopy. During daylight hours, Yokoi remained almost completely still, emerging only after sunset to gather food or check traps. Food became a daily calculation of risk and reward. He survived primarily on river shrimp, eels, fish, frogs, and wild plants. Bananas and papayas provided rare sweetness, but meat was scarce and precious. Using improvised traps and nets fashioned from salvaged fibers, Yokoi harvested just enough to survive, never allowing waste. Hunger was constant, but it was familiar. Over time, his body adapted to scarcity. His weight dropped, his skin grew pale from lack of sunlight, and his muscles thinned. Yet his mind remained sharp, sustained by routine and a relentless will to endure. Clothing, like shelter and food, was a product of ingenuity born from necessity. Drawing on his pre-war experience as a tailor, Yokoi wove fibers from tree bark into fabric, sewing them together with handmade needles. He repaired garments repeatedly, patching and reinforcing them until they were barely recognizable as clothing. Shoes were made from plant material and discarded rubber scraps. Nothing was wasted. Everything served a purpose. Each object he possessed was the result of labor, patience, and quiet determination. Loneliness, however, proved harder to engineer away. After his last remaining companions disappeared, either killed, captured, or lost to the jungle, Yokoi was truly alone. He spoke rarely, if ever, and when he did, it was to himself. Human interaction became something he remembered rather than experienced. Years passed without hearing his own voice spoken aloud to another person. Yet even then, he clung to discipline. He continued to groom himself, to maintain order in his shelter, and to observe what he believed were his duties as a soldier. Survival itself became his mission. By the 1960s, Yokoi was aware, at least intellectually, that the world above had changed. He saw signs of civilian life, new paths, cultivated land, distant sounds of machinery. He even occasionally stole supplies left unattended, including metal tools or cloth. These encounters confirmed his fear that exposure would bring death. Rather than prompting surrender, they reinforced his decision to remain hidden. Shame weighed heavily on him. In his mind, surviving when others had died was not a triumph but a failure. Returning home empty-handed, without having fulfilled his duty, felt dishonorable beyond redemption. This internal struggle became the defining feature of Yokoi's existence. He later explained that it was not ignorance that kept him hidden, but fear. Fear of disgrace, fear of rejection, and fear of a society that might not understand his survival. The war, though long over, continued within him. Each day he remained hidden was, in his mind, another day fulfilling his obligation as a soldier who had never been officially released from duty. In January 1972, that fragile world finally collapsed. Two local Chamorro men, checking animal traps near the river, noticed movement that did not belong to wildlife. When they approached, they encountered a thin, pale figure clutching a net. Yokoi reacted instinctively, attacking in desperation, attempting to seize one of their rifles. His strength, weakened by decades of deprivation, failed him. He was subdued quickly, confused and terrified. His first words were pleas for death. He believed capture meant torture, execution, or humiliation beyond endurance. Instead, he was fed. The shock of kindness was almost as overwhelming as capture itself. For the first time in nearly 3 decades, Yokoi sat indoors, surrounded by people who did not wish to kill him. When he was brought to authorities, Japanese officials were contacted, and communication finally bridged the gulf of years. Yokoi revealed his identity, his story unfolding slowly, cautiously, as if each word carried danger. He was 56 years old, a man who had lived more than half his life at war with time itself. When he returned to Japan weeks later, the country he encountered bore no resemblance to the one he had left. Television cameras, crowds, modern buildings, and unfamiliar customs overwhelmed him. He bowed deeply upon arrival, uttering words that would become famous, that he returned with much embarrassment. The nation hailed him as a symbol of endurance, yet he did not feel like a hero. He felt grief. Grief for comrades lost, for years vanished, and for a life spent in hiding while the world moved on without him. Yokoi's story forced Japan to confront its wartime legacy, the power of indoctrination, and the quiet suffering of individuals left behind by history. His survival was not driven by fanaticism or violence, but by fear, discipline, and an unwavering belief that surrender erased honor. In the silence of the jungle, that belief kept him alive and imprisoned long after the war had ended. By the early 1960s, Shoichi Yokoi had already spent nearly 2 decades hidden in the jungles of Guam, living a life that no longer resembled the modern world in any meaningful way. The island around him had transformed. Roads were built, villages expanded, American military installations became permanent, and civilian life slowly returned to normal. Yet Yokoi remained sealed away beneath the forest floor, clinging to a version of reality shaped entirely by wartime discipline and fear. For him, The war had never ended in the way it had for the rest of the world. It lingered as a constant presence, shaping every decision, every movement, every breath he took in the darkness of his underground shelter. Yokoi's existence had become one of rigid routine. During daylight hours, he remained almost completely motionless inside his cave, listening intently for sounds of human activity. Even distant voices or unfamiliar noises sent waves of anxiety through him. He understood that technology had advanced, that aircraft flew overhead more frequently, and that patrols might still be searching the jungle. Any encounter, he believed, would result in immediate execution. This fear was not irrational within the context of his training. Imperial Japanese doctrine had instilled in him the belief that capture was worse than death, and that surrender was an unforgivable disgrace, not only to himself, but to his family and ancestors. Survival, therefore, depended on invisibility. At night, he emerged cautiously. He moved slowly, deliberately, memorizing terrain and paths that allowed him to avoid open ground. His knowledge of the jungle became extraordinary. He could identify edible plants by touch alone and fish using handmade nets woven from plant fibers. His diet remained sparse but consistent. Shrimp, fish, frogs, bananas, coconuts, papayas, and whatever else he could safely gather. Protein was scarce, and malnutrition gradually weakened his body, but his discipline kept him alive. He rationed everything. Nothing was wasted. Even scraps of cloth were repaired repeatedly, stitched together using skills from his earlier life as a tailor. Time for Yokoi was measured not by calendars, but by the moon and the seasons. He tracked years mentally, counting cycles, marking anniversaries of battles long past. He knew, intellectually, that Japan had likely lost the war. Leaflets dropped by American forces had occasionally drifted into the jungle, but Yokoi dismissed them as enemy deception. Even when he became certain the war had ended, he refused to emerge. The reason was not ignorance, but shame. To return alive, he believed, would dishonor those who had died and expose him as a failure who had not fulfilled his duty. This belief hardened over time, becoming a psychological prison as confining as the jungle itself. By the late 1960s, Yokoi was alone. The few comrades who had once shared his hiding places were gone, either killed, captured, or lost to the elements. Floods destroyed shelters. Disease claimed lives quietly. When Yokoi realized he was the last one left, the weight of solitude deepened. Still, he endured. His cave became his entire world, a space carved with care and patience, reinforced with bamboo supports, ventilated through narrow shafts to allow smoke from his small cooking fire to escape. It was dark, damp, and cold at night, but it kept him hidden. It kept him alive. Then, on the evening of January 24th, 1972, everything changed. Two local Chamorro men were checking their shrimp traps along the Talifofo River when they noticed movement. At first, they assumed it was another villager. When Yokoi realized he had been seen, panic overtook him. Decades of fear surged at once. Acting on instinct, he charged toward them, attempting to seize a rifle. The confrontation was brief. Yokoi was weak, malnourished, and exhausted. He was quickly subdued. For the first time in nearly 30 years, he was physically restrained by other human beings. As he was pulled from the jungle, Yokoi begged to be killed. He expected torture, humiliation, or execution. Instead, he was fed. He was treated gently. The men who captured him did not strike or threaten him. This alone shattered his expectations. When authorities arrived and a Japanese interpreter finally spoke to him in his own language, Yokoi began to understand that the world he feared no longer existed. The war had ended not years ago, but decades earlier. Japan was no longer an empire. America was no longer his enemy in the way he had imagined. The realization was overwhelming. Shoichi Yokoi was brought out of the jungle and into the modern world with a mixture of disbelief, exhaustion, and profound emotional collapse. At 57 years old, his body bore the scars of decades of isolation, malnutrition, muscle atrophy, chronic illness, and the visible wear of a life spent underground. Yet the deeper wounds were psychological. Yokoi struggled to reconcile his internal reality with the world now surrounding him. Electric lights, automobiles, cameras, and crowds felt alien, almost threatening. For nearly 30 years, his survival had depended on silence and concealment. Now, he was suddenly exposed to global attention. When Yokoi was returned to Japan in February 1972, he was met by cameras, journalists, and massive public curiosity. To many, he appeared as a symbol of endurance and loyalty, a man who had remained faithful to his duty long after the rest of the world had moved on. To others, he was a living reminder of a militaristic ideology that had cost Japan millions of lives. Yokoi himself rejected any notion of heroism. In his first public statements, he expressed deep shame, famously saying that he was embarrassed to have returned alive. This sentence captured the tragedy of his story more clearly than any dramatic retelling ever could. Despite the public attention, Yokoi remained reserved and uncomfortable in the spotlight. He did not seek fame, nor did he attempt to profit from his experience. Interviews revealed a man burdened by survivors' guilt, haunted by memories of fallen comrades, and by the belief that he had failed them. He spoke quietly, often returning to themes of discipline, obedience, and regret. While some celebrated him as a national symbol, Yokoi privately struggled to adapt. The Japan he returned to was modern, prosperous, and vastly different from the rigid society he remembered. The values he had lived by were no longer central to national identity. In the years that followed, Yokoi attempted to rebuild a life. He married, gave lectures, and occasionally appeared in documentaries discussing his survival. Yet he never fully escaped the jungle psychologically. He continued to live simply, rejecting luxury and excess. Periodically, he returned to Guam, visiting the area where he had spent nearly half his life hidden. A replica of his cave was constructed for historical preservation, and his handmade tools and clothing were displayed in museums. These objects, stitched from bark and bamboo, became silent witnesses to an extraordinary human endurance shaped by fear and belief. Yokoi's story also reignited interest in other Japanese holdouts. His discovery helped prompt renewed searches that eventually led to the capture or surrender of other soldiers who had remained hidden long after the war, including Hiro Onoda. Yet Yokoi's case remained distinct. Unlike others who continued fighting, Yokoi had chosen concealment over violence. He harmed no civilians, fired no shots after the war, and sought only to survive without drawing attention. His resistance was inward, not outward. As historians later reflected on Yokoi's life, it became clear that his survival was not merely a tale of jungle skills, but a study in psychological endurance. His refusal to surrender was driven less by ignorance and more by indoctrination and shame. The fear of dishonor outweighed hunger, loneliness, and physical suffering. In this way, Yokoi embodied the extreme consequences of wartime ideology carried far beyond its original context. He was not frozen in time by accident, but by belief. Shoichi Yokoi died in 1997 at the age of 82. He was buried in Nagoya beneath a headstone that had originally been prepared decades earlier when he was declared legally dead. the irony was stark. For much of his life, the world believed he was gone, while he continued to exist unseen beneath the forest floor. His eventual return forced Japan and the wider world to confront uncomfortable questions about loyalty, obedience, and the human cost of war that lingers long after the fighting stops. Yokoi's story remains one of the most haunting legacies of World War II, not because of battles fought or enemies defeated, but because of what it reveals about survival under absolute belief. He did not refuse to surrender for 27 years out of defiance alone, but because surrender, to him, meant the complete collapse of identity. When he finally emerged from the jungle, he did not step into triumph, but into a quiet reckoning with a world that had moved on without him.